Many scholars argue that the events leading to the American Revolution began the same year the French and Indian War ended, 1763. With the French forced to leave North America, Native Americans in the region were left without their valuable ally, and the American colonists were left with a large expanse of land open for settlement in the Ohio Valley. As American settlers poured into the Ohio Valley, Native American groups had no choice but to defend their territory, and did so in a series of attacks that came to be known as Pontiac's Rebellion. In response to Pontiac's Rebellion, and in an attempt to cut the cost of defending settlers, the British government closed settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Parliament, i.e. Britain's legislature, thought this proclamation of 1763 would help the colonists by bringing them security, but it only enraged the land-hungry Americans. Many had come to the New World to secure property, and now the British government, half a world away, was taking that right away. Many colonists decided to just ignore the law and move anyway. The British government could do little to stop the migration, but this response to the new law angered them because, as they saw it, the colonists paid very little for their own defense and had no right to create an extra burden on the treasury. Still, Parliament was unable to respond to increasing encroachments on Native American lands. With the continued expense of defending the colonists from Native American attacks and the enormous debt left behind by the French and Indian War, the British government turned to the colonies to help pay. The British government held on to the long-practiced policy of mercantilism, the belief that the colonies were established for the benefit of the mother country. But the colonists came to believe that the government had no right to regulate the economy. Using the Enlightenment belief that nature ruled society, the colonists came to believe in free trade, the idea that the government had no right to interfere with commerce. Because of the rise of free trade ideology, the British government had trouble controlling colonial shipping. Colonial trade had been controlled by a series of laws called the Navigation Acts. These laws determined where merchant ships could dock and what items they could trade. Using free trade ideology, merchants ignored the British mercantile laws whenever possible, and smuggling, importing or exporting goods illegally, became common. To increase revenue, Parliament passed the Sugar Act in 1764. This law placed a tax on sugar, molasses, and other products shipped to the colonies. In reaction to smuggling, it also called for strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts and harsh punishment for illegal trade. Another law intended to raise revenue was the Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act placed a tax on colonial legal documents and newspapers. The Sugar Act was somewhat successful, but with the Stamp Act, instead of the colonists cooperating to pay the tax, the British government had inspired a revolt. In response to the Stamp Act, colonists organized boycotts, agreements to not buy goods, and demonstrated against the tax. Colonial leaders also wrote petitions, letters asking for action, to the government, headed by George III, in hopes of reversing the taxes. Colonists used the slogan, "No taxation without representation," to express their anger at taxes being imposed without their consent. The American strategy worked well, but George's government did not change their overall philosophy on controlling trade. Colonial petitions and continued boycotts eventually forced Parliament to repeal the law, but the British government later replaced that tax with another, called the Townshend Act. This tax on glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea was followed by more protests and boycotts, and on March 5, 1770, the British government again decided to repeal the taxes. All the taxes were lifted except the one on tea. The government felt it needed to show that it had the right to tax the colonies. In 1773, the British Parliament took another step that angered the colonists. The government passed the Tea Act, which gave a monopoly to the British East India Company in the trade of tea to the colonies. The Tea Act was intended to control colonial smuggling of tea from the Netherlands. The Tea Act actually made tea cheaper in the colonies, but it still angered American consumers because it was yet another regulation. It angered smuggling merchants because it hurt their profits. Finally, on the night of December 16, 1773, a group called the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, gathered in Boston Harbor and threw 342 cases of tea into the harbor in protest against British trade policy. As the crowd cheered and shouted, the raiders destroyed 90,000 pounds of tea worth thousands of dollars. This act of rebellion became known as the Boston Tea Party. In reaction to the Boston Tea Party, the British government decided to close the port of Boston, send soldiers to Boston to guard government property, abolish the Massachusetts legislature, and cut the powers of town governments through a series of laws that became known as the Intolerable Acts. Colonial leaders decided to meet in Philadelphia in 1774 to discuss how to react to these new laws. This meeting was called the First Continental Congress. The Congress demanded the repeal of the Intolerable Acts and declared that the colonies had the right to tax and govern themselves. It also called for the training of militias to stand up to British troops if necessary. The necessity would come on April 18, 1775, when British redcoats marched to arrest Samuel Adams and seize weapons stored in Concord, Massachusetts. On the morning of April 19th, violence broke out at Lexington Green, a shot heard round the world.